across the socioeconomic spectrum. We see it among men, we see it among women, and that's what results in that 70% of black children being born to unmarried parents, right, is that racial gap in marriage. And I should note that this racial gap in marriage is not simply a gap in formal marriage, right? So it's not the case that you have large numbers of people who are, living together and unmarried in a long period of time, right? It really is an issue of a lack of stable, enduring, committed relationships. Sort of a lack of partnership is what we see in the marriage decline here. And I can talk about how this compares to what's happening in other countries, and I talk about that in the book, but just keep in mind that the marriage, when I say marriage decline, that's really a shorthand for the decline of stable, committed, monogamous relationships. And we see that throughout society, but especially among African Americans. So a pivotal factor in this marriage decline is that women have moved ahead, which is a good thing, but men have fallen behind. And this as a parent of 3 boys. This is this is a very difficult book to write. I'll just say it was a difficult book to write. It's a difficult book to write because, when you write about the Supreme Court's definition of racial discrimination in these particular cases and how that changed, or, whether someone should have standing, you can't only get so worked up about that, right? But and this book started out as a more purely legal book, I should add too, that was really focused on family policy. But then the personal issues got to be so interesting that I decided to zero in on those. But the personal issues are also issues that hit very close to home for all of us, because we all live in families. Many of us have been or are or want to be married and either do or might have children. So all of these issues hit close to home. And one of the issues that hits close to home for me is the fact that while black women have done well in many respects, black men have struggled in a way that is very distressing. Twice as many black women as black men graduate from college every year. Twice as many. It's actually, for those sticklers out there, it's actually 1.95 to 1, okay? But we're gonna round that up to 2, right? 1.95 to 1, right? So about twice as many black women as men graduate from college. And that is a striking statistic. It is the case as well that among the population in general, more women than men graduate from college now. Right? So again, we see this development throughout society, but especially pronounced among African Americans, where we have 2 to 1 in college. Black women even dominate black men in traditionally male fields such as computer science. In engineering, there are more black women who are majoring in computer science or engineering right now and who will receive degrees this year than there are black men by far. Black women are approaching 2 to 1 nationwide in law school and medical school. So we have these huge gaps. And then at the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, 1 in 10 black men, more than 1 in 10 black men, in fact, is in prison or jail as we speak. These are men in their 20s to early 30s. This is like prime marriaging age. And 1 in 10, actually about 1 in 9, but we'll just say 1 in 10 are in jail or prison. 1 in 4 are estimated to spend time in jail or prison, right? So the backdrop for relationships now among African Americans is a world where there are twice as many black women as men graduating from college, and 10% or more of the men are just out of circulation, right? And then there's another large percentage that may not be in jail, but their lives are not looking real promising, right? So the question then is, well, what happens when we create that skewed gender ratio? And one way to understand what happens is when we create that ratio is to think about the relationships as a market. This is the framework I've used really throughout the book. Right? This is a book that's not very romantic, right? So if you want someone who's going to explain, how you can visualize your reality and bring it about simply by envisioning it, which one of my sisters says, if you envision what you want, it'll happen. This is not a book that goes into all that, right? This is a book that just says, look, here are the facts, here's the information. The fact is we have this many men, this many women, people are out there in the relationship market, and what happens in that relationship market is going to be influenced a lot by the numbers of men and women. And so one thing that happens in that relationship market is that higher achieving women are more likely than they've ever been to marry lower achieving men, right? So more than half of college-educated black wives have a less educated husband. That's another striking statistic, right? So you can just simply, you can think of college-educated women, about 50% of them are married to a guy who didn't graduate from college. This is among African Americans. 50% of black women are married to a guy who didn't graduate from college. But it's also true that among whites, women are about 4, 5, 6 times as likely as they were 30 or 40 years ago to earn more than their husbands, right? 30 or 40 years ago, in 1970, I think, say there were only 2 or 3% of wives who earned more than their husbands. Now it's 25%. So it's about 1/4. So again, trends in the same direction, but more extreme among African Americans and among other groups. So that's one development. The other development, so black women lead in a sense. They're at the front end of the decline in marriage and the front end of the marrying less educated or lower earning men. But they trail in another development, and that's with respect to interracial marriage. And this is the puzzle that really pulled me throughout the book to try to figure this out. Black women have the smallest group of men within their race to marry. Black women have the smallest group of men within their race to marry, right? Because of incarceration, educational underachievement, economic failures on the part of black men. Yet they're also the least likely to marry someone of another race. Right? Only about 10%, actually less than 10% of black women, even looking at recent marriages, will marry someone of a different race. Whereas for black men, it's between 2 and 3 times as much as that. So black men are between 2 and 3 times as likely to marry someone of another race as black women. Asian Americans and Latinos are also more than 3 times as likely as black women to marry outside their race. So black women simply are, in terms of their intimate lives, the most segregated group in the nation. And you might even think that black women are especially likely to marry lower earning men and especially likely to be unmarried because they don't marry across group lines. This is where all the trouble starts here, right? And then the question is, my question was really, why is that? And would it be a good thing if more black women married across group lines? And I'll just say here, there are a bunch of different reasons for why black women are so segregated in their intimate lives. I think of it really like a puzzle with different pieces. There are a lot of different pieces to the puzzle, right? One piece to the puzzle is that black women are disinclined to marry across group lines because we, as a society, have made so many of them feel that if they did so, they would be abandoning black men, betraying the race, leaving brothers behind, however you want to put it, right? There's a sense that what a good black woman would do is to hang in there with the black man, even as, or especially because the black men have struggled so much. And that somehow it's the black woman's role to help him and lift him and pull him along, right? What would be worse, according to this view, than to go to a place like Stanford and become successful and have a job as a banker or a lawyer or something, and then, abandon your group, right? That's the message that we've given black women in all sorts of ways, and that results in many feeling that they don't have the option to marry across group lines. And the story of the book is basically one thread of the story is that, well, actually, no, black women have more options than they think, more options than we've led them to believe that they think, and that actually it would be a good thing if more black women were to do the same thing that other groups of people have done and to expand their options in terms of their relationships. And if they expanded their options in terms of their relationships, we would have more black women marrying men of other races, and that would be positive. In fact, I argue that those women would, in many cases, have better relationships with non-black men who have a similar socioeconomic status than they would with black men who have a different socioeconomic status. In other words, those women would actually be better matched with the person they sat next to in law school, say, who might be Asian American or Latino or white or Middle Eastern. They'd have a better relationship with that guy than the black guy they grew up with, but who, for whatever reason, did not go to college. So that's one argument. And again, I say this is not my opinion, I'm the messenger. I'm the messenger. I'm the one who distills the information. So, whenever I make a claim and someone says, well, how do you know that? Why do you say that? Well, my answer would be, well, there's research on that, right? And there usually is, and there actually is research on this even, that black women who marry men of other races actually do have lower divorce rates, frankly. This is another surprising thing. They have lower divorce rates, according to the best available research, than black women who marry black men. I just put that out there. Black women who marry men of other races have lower divorce rates than black women who marry black men, and part of the reason for that, I think, is because a lot of the black women who marry black men are married to guys who they're not well matched with. And part of the reason they're not well matched is because they have a whole different set of experiences, aspirations, sensibilities, education levels, professional trajectories, all of that stuff. So that's one statement that's got me into a lot of trouble. The other statement that gets me into a lot of trouble is that, in fact, if black women are concerned about African American marriages, the best thing that they could do to bolster marriage among African Americans would actually be to open their options to men of other races. Right? So there's the paradox there that by considering interracial relationships, they actually bolster relationships within the race. Right? And the reason that is because part of the problem when you have the skewed gender ratio is that the group that's in short supply has a lot of power. So because black men are scarce, frankly, black men have a lot more power than black women do in relationships, because black men have a lot more options than black women do, right? So lots of women means lots of options for men, few men means few options for women. And that shapes the relationship. And this is not only true among African Americans, this is true generally, right? We have researchers who've looked at gender ratios on college campuses because, again, women are the majority in college now. And when you look at college campuses, you find that there are campuses that vary dramatically in their gender ratios, right? Some are 50-50, or even 55-45 men, and others are 65-35 women. And some researchers have looked at that and concluded that the gender ratio on campus has a pretty strong influence on the type of relationships that people have on those campuses. So when men are in short supply, say when they're 35% of the population and women are 65%, that means men have more power because they have more options. And if they have more power, they can dictate the type of relationships that occur. And so what sort of relationships do we think men might want versus what women might want? And it just turns out that the men in the relationship, in the campuses where the men are in short supply, researchers have found that there tend to be fewer boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, fewer long-term monogamous relationships, so on and so right there. I was surprised by this, right? But that's a finding that some people think is really sensible, that men and women might have different ideas about the type of relationship they want, and so that men use their power to have relationships that are to their liking, whereas women would use their power to have different types of relationships that are to their liking. So that's what happens on college campuses. We also see evidence that sex ratios matter when we look at China, say. Right? So China is a flip side of what we see on college campuses, right? Because there are a lot of men and few women as a result of one-child policy. But it's also the case that gender ratios vary across Chinese provinces. And so researchers have looked and said, well, let's see how varying gender ratios influences people's behavior. And what they find there is that in areas where there are even more men than average relative to the number of women, the men work harder, they save more money, they buy bigger houses, they do all these things that you can only interpret as something that would give them an advantage in the search for a wife. When the competition is stiffer, they step up their game, right? Because they know, right, that the competition is stiffer. Again, so this is in China, right, the opposite side, right? So we see this, and this is a very difficult thing to study because there are always so many variables that might influence, obviously, people's behavior. But it seems sensible that the sex ratio might influence the behavior of men and women. And so with African Americans, we see that African American men, even the highest earning men, are much less likely than their white counterparts to be married. And there's some evidence even that the highest earning black men, men who earn more than $100,000 a year, are even less likely to be married than men who earn, say, $50,000 a year or $60,000 a year. So there's a big gap in marriage, and there's even a drop-off in marriage for the highest earning African Americans. And part of the story there would be that African American men, like men of any group, might become disinclined to marry when they don't have to.